existing regime has given birth to a yet another crisis, not only for the region but for the international community as well. Here I mean to say that the refugees that are going out of the country, out of Syria, they are trying to reach Europe this way or that way. They are taking illegal means, but once they are reaching there, that has given birth to another crisis for the European community, and that is the European refugee crisis, and some people are calling it also the immigration crisis. You might have observed the picture of that small child who was dead and washing at the shores of Turkey. That was one big indicator of this development. That has really shaken the world to the core. That has been taken into account by the international community from the right from the Eastern Europe to the Western European side. And now everybody is talking about giving shelter to these refugees, giving them some of the rights that they deserve. But they are not talking about the real problem. They are not considering the fact that why they have been forced to leave their lands. Of course, this immigration crisis is a part of this whole discussion, but we have to delve deep into this issue and look at the Middle Eastern crisis. We have to talk about ISIS. We have to talk about the role of the Middle Eastern elders, particularly Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, and also Jordan, and maybe the UAE. Why they are contributing into this crisis, why they are not helping them out, and why the international community is taking a silent leap on this whole problem that we are facing at the moment. So there are a host of issues that we will be talking about. Let me introduce you to the guest I have. I have Dr. Aqab Malik. He is teaching in National Defense University and he's talking about international affairs. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And we are also joined by Dr. Bakr Najmuddin. He has been working on international affairs and particularly the politics of Europe. Bakr, thank you very much for joining us. Right. So, Aqab, how do you summarize the whole thing? Is it just the immigration crisis or there is something there? I think for me it is the tail that is wagging the dog.
I think you need to look at the origins of the whole crisis, which is stems from the Arab Spring.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, the idea was that the Arab Spring was supposed to bring about, the hope was that it was supposed to bring about a lot of positive change.
Mm-hmm.
However, you have vested interests, you have strategic interests from different countries around that region, in the region and around the world, to change particular dynamics and political dynamics, which interfered in that change and didn't allow it to occur. And that has caused a lot of crisis because the action-reaction effect and the continuous downward spiral into conflict in that region has destroyed many lives, and the situation has changed so much so that nobody knows really what is going on the ground, especially with the arrival of the Islamic State, for example, other groups, Al-Nusra Front, the Free Syrian Army disappeared, for example. Nobody knows where they've gone. In fact, they've joined these other militant groups to have more strategic effect because they're not working as well against Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian army. And when you have Western or Eastern or any external interference from the outside for their own vested interests, like we did in Afghanistan during the 1990s when Mujahideen were fighting each other, a proxy war emerged to destroy the country.
Okay.
And this is exactly the same reoccurrence of history that is happening in Syria and in Libya, where there was external interference of some uprising to take out, you could say,
the existing
Gaddafi,
regime,
existing regime, that changed the dynamics of the whole situation for other interests rather than the interests of the people on the ground in those countries.
So how it has contributed to the development of a bigger crisis of refugees or the immigration crisis?
Well, if you see what's happening in Libya, if you see what's happening in Iraq and Syria, you'll notice that the countries are virtually destroying themselves from within and from without.
Okay.
People need to live. If you're living in an environment and you grow up in an environment that you know is your history, your childhood, your future, you could say, and it's all destroyed in front of you, your friends, your family, either killing each other or dying as a result, it brings about a national trauma at every level. And when you have a national trauma at every level, and there's no future, no hope, no need for existence, and you traumatize yourself as an individual, what options do you have? Where you can't see any future for existence, you want to get out. And then we have to look at how this occurred. I mean, it's not a matter of a blame game, but those people or those countries that took part in this conflict that exacerbated this conflict must take responsibility.
Okay, let me go on to Bakr. Bakr, is it really the fixation of the responsibility, the matter here, that we should talk about the people or the countries who have exacerbated this crisis, or we have to see the end at the moment that is going on, the refugee crisis that is going on in the eastern and particularly in Germany, and we are also now talking about Paris and in the UK that the refugees are going there as well?
First and foremost, I need to mention and kind of support the view of Dr. Saab that the whole crisis has to be given an historical analysis for the very fact that the invasion of Iraq accentuated the whole crisis. I think the beginning of this crisis has to go back to 2003 or 2001 when Iraq was invaded. Relatively, the region was peaceful before the invasion of Iraq, but quite unfortunate after the demise of Saddam and the whole Middle East got into confusion. So the Ulabalu in the Middle East should not be blamed on the stupid, so to say, the ineffectiveness of the leadership in the Middle East. Rather, we need to look at the external interference that have exacerbated this whole crisis. Otherwise, Syrians were living in a very luxurious life before the invasion. The Iraqis were living in a better life before the invasion. The Libyans were living one of the best life in Africa before the invasion.
How do you define this best life? Because the invaders or the so-called people who attacked them, they said, we are going to give them liberty, we are going to give them the free life. They were under suppression. You talk about the Kurds and the Shias during the Saddam Hussein regime, they were crying for help.
There is a question of who defined liberty. How did define it? Is it internally defined or externally defined? So is it an imposed liberty or a sort of realized liberty? So the question here is that when you look at the societies in Middle East and North Africa, you find some sort of peaceful environment. I'm taking an example of Libya, coming from Africa. I do understand, I do know how the Libyans, they regarded Gaddafi not as a leader, rather they regarded him as a father. They used to call him the father of the nation because Gaddafi never saw them as just ordinary citizens. They were referred to as family. And as on record, I want to say, if you go to Libya today, even before the demise of Gaddafi, Gaddafi used to say, I will never build a house for my parents if the Libyan citizens don't have a shelter.
Okay.
So health facilities are there for the Libyans, free scholarship are there for the Libyans before the invasion of Libya. And that is also the case with Iraq before the invasion of Iraq.
You are discounting the problems of the Kurds and the Shias during Saddam regime. I'm not privy to
I would want to say that this was kind of accentuated by the external forces. It's a kind of divide and rule.
Okay, let me get a point of view from Aqab. Aqab, do you agree with this point of view that during the Saddam regime there were no atrocities or there were no excesses?
I never said there was no atrocities. I never said so.
Or they were not of that much magnitude that invited the international intervention?
Let's not get it wrong. There was no UN resolution for the invasion of Iraq. So the international community was not in agreement with this. By far and large, to the large countries in Europe, for example, France and Germany were absolutely against this. So it was
the British and the US
essentially with a few coalition countries that they more or less got together through inducement incentives to invade a country to finish off what they thought they should have done in 1991. And let's look at it this way. 1991, whatever happened in Kuwait, and the United States and the international community went in to take Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, was one thing. But that war didn't stop. It continued on a lower level, and then it finalized, and it continues now. The difference is here that different interests came to the fore. More vested interests, oil, understanding the oil, the dynamics at play in Iraq were very different from what they are in Libya. But there are certain similarities. However, with Saddam Hussein, you're right. He was a tyrant. He didn't allow large percentages of the population a certain amount of freedoms. He dominated. But let's come to the fore and look at 2015, 12 years later, the state of the country in Iraq.
Yeah, it's in
Now,
turmoil.
And we'll understand that maybe eventually, in the distant future, something may come about. We've lost a generation more of development in that country, primarily because of external interference of vested interest.
Okay, how do you relate this development in Iraq? We know that there was something happening as far as ISIS is concerned, because they were anti the present government that is working in Iraq. But how do you relate with the Syrian situation? There were the heydays of Mr. Assad and then the Bashar al-Assad, and suddenly what happened?
I think you look at what happened in Iraq. I don't really appreciate talking about sectarianism in the way most people do, because I understand it very differently. It's more about vested interests, utilizing populations for your own personal benefits, and the leadership does
But eventually they take the tone of sectarianism.
But that's what happens, unfortunately, because most people fall into that trap. Unfortunately, Maliki, who was the president or prime minister in Iraq, he didn't use his powers to the greatest effect for the benefit of the whole of Iraq and all the citizens of Iraq.
Okay.
He sidelined the Sunnis, which felt betrayed to an extent that, fine, Saddam Hussein had gone. They were at the height during Saddam Hussein. Now they felt that they were being used, and there was a revenge factor in that. So there's a certain form of rebellion to that, and there's a certain form of revenge to what now the Shias were doing. Rather than coming back and taking power and using it for the benefit of the whole Iraq, there was a lot of sectarian divide increased by Maliki's government. And as a result, and this is well known, and as a result, you had one of the biggest mistakes that the US made was to disband the Iraqi Ba'athist army, who are predominantly the leadership of ISIS, or the Islamic State.
At the moment.
So I question their religious incentives, primarily because Ba'athist officers were not very religious, primarily because Ba'athism is more socialistic and communistic in orientation, which is atheistic. So I question ISIS and their foundations, but they may use religious ideology to recruit as well.
Okay.
So there's a difference.
Well, Bakr, if you put it this way, that there was the international intervention that has really kick-started this whole process. But if you look at the situation, then the role of Saudi Arabia, the role of Egypt, the role of Jordan, maybe of UAE, even silence is a crime in this situation, but they were even helping and abetting the people who were trying to increase the turmoil.
Yeah, I do agree with that these external forces within the region, or these regional contexts, also tells us why this crisis continues to become a kind of a plague for the Muslim Ummah.
Yeah, it's a plague,
and, I used to ask myself a question: where is the concept of Ummah at this junction? And how does the Middle Eastern countries, the Gulf countries, despite their richness, open the door to these refugees? One, we can understand that they are they have this phobia that if we allow these refugees to come into our country, this would also kind of aggravate our own tension. Number one,
exporting of extremism.
Exporting of extremism. This might be the underlying argument, but that is not the real argument. The most important would be the economic pressure on their country.
For my understanding, this economic document or the economic argument is taking the garb to cover their sentiments against militancy or extremism.
But the situation is this. It again goes back with this old debate. Why do we allow the West, or why do we allow the external forces to decide our fate? And this is how we have to understand the phenomena of ISI. That when you look at the debate or the discourse of ISI is not just simply against the established, ISIS, I'm very sorry. ISIS is not simply against the regime in the Middle East. It's looking at the old Western phenomena. When you look at the argument that we want to redraw the boundary that was drawn after the First World War. So it is not as if ISIS is trying to...
You better call it only IS.
Obviously, I'm not against the... So the Islamic State have to be given a kind of civil society discourse. Why do I say that? they see themselves as the freedom fighters that we are trying to push away, just as the Mujahideen in Afghanistan says, we're trying to push away.
No, what are they trying to portray themselves by public beheadings and floggings and having the human markets there? So people are getting more and more wary against their practices. They don't want to come into the main fora.
And that is the mistake. And that is the mistake of the Taliban.
Perhaps that's how they are. That's not a mistake.
No. It is a mistake. It is a mistake in the sense that they fail to understand how civil society works.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
They fail to understand, because as a civil society, you need to have the techniques of mobilizing the people.
No, and look at this, Bakr. If you're talking about that these are the elders of the Saddam regime who have eventually joined this Baghdadi clan.
Not entirely.
Not entirely, but they are people. They must be knowing what they have been doing with Saddam Hussein. They must be knowing what is the Western or the modern style of thinking. You can't live with the human market.
Yes.
So what they are trying to portray here, I'm not trying to go against their policies, but I'm not taking this that they are so naive that they don't understand how that works today.
And at the same time, I'm not being the devil advocate. I'm not advocating for them. What I'm simply looking at it is the sense of civil society and the sense of trying to resist the external intervention. I would say Islamic State is not entirely the former Ba'athist regime.
Yeah.
It's an amalgam of so many things. It's an amalgam of so many things, so many forces. And we do not have a concrete evidence to suggest that this is exact picture of Islamic State.
Look at Syria once again. I'll try to bring you back out of the jaws of IS in Iraq. Look at the Syrian situation. Many people say that this is the cruel policies of Bashar al-Assad, who have literally ignited the whole process. The al-Nusra Front, although Free Syrian Army has gone for the moment at least, but this is the blowback from the people, that you keep on oppressing them, repressing them, and then they have to bounce back at you.
Well, there's no doubt. Dictatorships have a cutoff date.
Yeah.
There's a cutoff date now.
If ever it is.
Everywhere in the world, I reckon that, especially because of the height of the media, social media, people have more awareness of their surroundings and what their rights could be. And people want this. When they see examples of what's happening around the world and what they can acquire, they want this themselves, and then they talk about it and then build a consensus on the population. When the Arab Spring came in Syria, I think it was very unique, but it was very much in demand, and it was needed there. However, it was taken advantage of. Now, the trouble in Iraq was arising. The United States had left officially in 2008 when they completed their operations, and Malki's government was in charge, and he was using the wrong policies, and he disaffected a large section of those policies, especially the Sunni Muslims and the former insurgents, and there was a lot of people from the death squads who had a lot of blood on their hands, who went and considered something else. When they saw Syria erupt, this is another front. This is another front, because boundaries may be there in official guise, which were divided after the First World War and Second World War, for example, but these were artificial boundaries. These people had commonalities with each other, not just culture and religion and families. So they had a relationship with each other, and it just went across a so-called international border. And that's what happened. So the ISIS filled that gap, that vacuum that was created by Bashar al-Assad, because he wasn't able to provide what the people wanted. We also have to look at how ethnic politics plays its part and sectarian politics plays its part, where in Syria the Alawites are a very small minority, ruling over a majority Sunni population. So now you have a reversal of the issue.
Okay, let me just go on to the real thing that is happening in Eastern Europe. Particularly, we are talking about here the Hungarian policies and also the German policies. Are they really painting themselves as very generous and magnanimous people? That now they're opening up their hands. Everybody is praising Angela Merkel. That look at she is the real hero of the humanity. Or there is something underneath lurking there.
Let me begin to say that the German strategy have always been to keep a low profile. Germany, since the end of the Second World War, never wanted to take the leadership of the whole continental Europe for basic reasons. But however, the date and the publicized picture of that Iraqi, or is it Iraqi or Syrian?
Yeah, it's the Syrian child. Yeah.
I think change the whole equation about this humanitarian crisis, one.
Yeah.
But one more important thing is that we don't expect Hungary or the Eastern European countries to open the door to these refugees because of their own economic crisis. At the moment, the EU or the Eurozone is facing what I call the economic trauma. So they are yet to get out of the trauma. And so you don't expect them on a very rational ground. You don't expect them to open their ground.
If you listen to the talks given by different refugees or the refugee or the aspirant immigrants, they ultimately want to reach either France or Germany. They don't want to live in Austria or maybe
simply because they know. Simply because they know that Western Europe is more wealthy than the Eastern European countries, and perhaps because of the kind of regimes in this country, there is a growing trend of nationalism going on in this country.